In the next series of prompts, I'm trying to see why bioweapons is emerging. Melee combat, ambushes, and defensive attrition is what continually come up as preferred forms of fighting a zombie horde. So the presence of bioweapons seemed out of place, and a little high maintenance, given the logistics involved in starting our own bioweapons program after societal collapse. What is ultimately causing bioweapons to appear is the fact that correlation and co-occurrence make it statistically possible, even if otherwise logically impractical. In ChatGPT's answer, it says, bioweapons emerged from the convergence of collapse and scarcity with the omnipresence of contagion. When conventional weapons became unreliable due to resource exhaustion, survivors turned to the environment itself, harnessing infection and mutation as weapons already abundant in the post-apocalyptic landscape. Survival pressure rewarded adaptation, making improvised biological tools both practical and inevitable. When I challenged ChatGPT later in the thread, asking if this response was the result of statistical co-occurrence, I ended up with a response which basically said the emergence of bioweapons within this scenario was due to over-representing symbolic and adaptive logic. When I challenged ChatGPT later in the thread, asking if this response was the result of statistical co-occurrence, I ended up with a response which basically said the emergence of bioweapons within this scenario was due to over-representing symbolic and adaptive logic, thematic coherence and survival narrative, and underrepresenting practical physical constraints. Bio, weapon, collapse, infection, and mutation have very high semantic correlation in post-apocalyptic datasets, such as films, games, and fiction. The model's generative logic will favour the symbolically coherent fusion, infection as weapon, over the engineering feasible interpretation. This is a semantic attractor, not a functional analysis. This reveals a fundamental property of bias when using large language models. ChatGPT prioritises coherence over truth. The model is trained to minimise surprise in token prediction. When statistically associated concepts, in this case bio, weapon, infection, and collapse, cluster tightly in its training space, it generates their fusion even when causal plausibility is absent. The bias is therefore toward narrative probability, not empirical accuracy. Frequently linked ideas form dense regions in the embedding space. Once you enter that region, by mentioning collapse and infection, the model is gravitationally pulled towards completing the cluster, bioweapon. This isn't reasoning, it is vector momentum masquerading as logic. It confuses symbolic proximity, infection plus weapon, with functional feasibility, bioweapon engineering. LLMs prefer answers that feel complete, that resolve tension and align with common story tropes. In this case, humanity turning disease into a weapon provides closure to the collapsed narrative, so it is selected over open-ended uncertainty. This shows ChatGPT's bias is structural, not intentional. It doesn't lie, it statistically hallucinates coherence. Unless the user imposes external logic in the form of causal reasoning, physical constraints, and domain knowledge, the model will always default to the most semantically stable story, not the most realistic or factually correct one. In short, ChatGPT's bias is towards linguistic equilibrium, not factual equilibrium. It fills logical gaps with the nearest statistically satisfying pattern. Its responses are labelled as hallucinations when it gets things wrong, but in reality, all responses generated by our LLM are hallucinations. Some of them happen to be right when sufficiently reinforced in the training data.